بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's my pleasure to address you here at the coffee corner for Masjid Ansar. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this effort something that is of benefit for those who arrange it on Yawm al-Qiyamah, inshallah. I've been asked by the brother Fuad, who messaged me a few weeks ago about speaking on the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was done in 1948, following the Second World War. And it reminded me of something. I went in 2012 to Libya, and I took there with me some lawyers. And the revolution was happening at that time, so there were armed soldiers, armed revolutionaries at the checkpoints, and we just entered from Tunisia into towards Tripoli. And as we were passing the borders, I remember we were stopped, and myself and some lawyers from here in the UK, they were white Caucasian lawyers, and I was translating, and I said salam wa alaikum salam to them as they stopped us, and they said, Man antum? Who are you? As they were armed with their weapons. And I said to them, Nahnu huquqiyin. I said, we're people who have come with rights, people of rights. And that's understood to be people of human rights. And he said, Wa alaykum as-salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, ahlan wa sahlan bikum, bas li'ilmik, ma andana huquq huna. He replied by saying, you're most welcome here, but let us forewarn you, we have no rights over here. And it was taken as a joke, in that you are talking about rights, but we have no rights here. And you wonder to yourself that what is it that in a ummah like the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, when we know that we have haqqul muslim ala muslim, that the rights of a Muslim upon a Muslim, huquq al-ibad, the rights of the worshippers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon them and of Allah upon them, that we have right after right. In fact, one of Allah's names is Al-Haq, Al-Adl. All of these names to do with justice and right. That how is it that today in the 21st century we are a people who don't understand the practical application, knowledge or implementation of rights? Now there are those who argue that human rights, the term human rights, is not from the Islamic lexicon. It's not an originally Islamic term. And that's true, because the term, as I said, mentioned is huquq al-ibad. That's mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah. But what does it mean in today's world, when human rights is a matter of violation that takes place largely in the Muslim world, and those rights are removed on a day-to-day basis, despite the fact that so many Muslim countries are signatories to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We lost this.
Yeah, it's fine.
Replacing the batteries. So the sisters come here at the moment.
Yeah.
When they can.
Hopefully
Shall I wait?
Are you ready, brother?
So can the sisters hear when I speak?
No,
They can't.
No,
Okay.
I think the brother's doing the business now.
I think you should just carry on for a bit.
Okay. My apologies, sisters. I'm going to try and raise my voice so you can hear me, inshallah. So we are in a position today where the very concept of human rights is something that, because it's been put in from a Western framework, that we think is antithetical, or it has no real place in Islam. And that's the issue that I really want to address in relation to how does Islam regard the rights of the individual, and what are these rights? And are the rights that are encompassed and enshrined within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are they compatible with Islam? So getting back to the whole thing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, why did they have this? Understand this today, where we are a nation, Muslims are our nations around the world, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Burma, Yemen, all of these countries, Libya, Egypt, in one way or another are embroiled in some kind of turmoil, whether it's war, whether it's famine, whether it's torture chambers, whether it's detention without trial, whether it's the removal of the presumption of innocence, whether it's houses being bulldozed, whether it's people being skinned alive, people being starved. That's happening. Whether it's rape used as a weapon of war, it's happening by Muslims to Muslims, as well as by Muslims to non-Muslims, as well as by non-Muslims to Muslims. It's happening across the board. But how can this ummah that has claimed such of the highest ideals of mankind, we often say that Islam is a perfect religion. Don't blame Islam upon the practice of the people. So how can this religion that has such perfection from divine authority be at such a low stage? And you have to look at, despite all of that, there was a time when it wasn't the Muslims, and it's in recent times. There are people alive to this day who remember that the problem wasn't the Muslim world. The problem in the world wasn't the Muslim world. The problem was Europe. What is the evidence for this? The evidence is just recently we've been looking at the commemoration of 100 years since the end of World War I. Bear this in mind. World War. In Arabic they call it Harb al-Alam. Now, what does it mean to have a world war? That every country in the world, or every aspect of the world, or different parts of the world, Far East, Southeast Asia and South America, are affected by this. That the world is encompassed in a war. And this was primarily something that started and ended in Europe. World War I, where the European nations tore each other to pieces, invented weapons the likes of which mankind has never seen, and advanced its own state because the military was advancing. So a lot of the advances that you see in science today, a lot of those advances came through the military project of trying to make your military a stronger military. But the purpose wasn't to better the life of people. The purpose was to defeat your enemies, to create weapons. And that's what they did, the race of war against the Germans in World War I with the Allies. That was what led to the deaths of over 20 million people. 20 million people, bear that in mind, because we're told that Islam is the perpetrator of the worst atrocities today. 20 million, that's just in World War I. Within living memory, and literally many of those who partook in World War I did the same thing again. Same countries, essentially, same allies, same axis, same battlefields, but they expanded it. So there were battles taking place, like the Battle of River Plate in Argentina, between the Germans and the British. And there were battles taking place all the way in Singapore, between the British and the Japanese. So they had encompassed this into literally a world war. Indians were fighting in Burma for the British. In the Philippines, they were fighting against the Japanese. The Americans were fighting against the Japanese. They were fighting everywhere. And as a result, they were fighting in Russia, in Stalingrad, in Leningrad. And millions of people were getting killed in this war. 6 million Jews gassed to death in death camps, as well as gypsies, as well as other groups of people. So the world was on fire. And it's hard. Britain, London was bombed under the Blitz. Over 30,000 people were killed in your own streets where you live today. Islam wasn't responsible for this. Islam had nothing to do with this. In fact, they were fighting wars on Islamic land in Libya, in Egypt, at Tobruk, at Al-Alamein, famous battlefields between Rommel and Montgomery, which was the German field commanders and the British field commanders, fighting on Muslim lands, and the Muslims, as if they're oblivious, as if they've got nothing to do with it. Somebody enters your home and fights each other for it, and you just a bystander. That's what was going on. So at the end of this process, when they recognized, especially after they found the death camps, Auschwitz and Birkenau and Sobibor and all of these other camps that were in Poland, but run by the Germans for the final solution, because on the basis of racism, the basis of judging a people on their religious appearance, their religious practice, they said that these people are responsible for all of our evils, therefore we need to eradicate them. They introduced, first of all, laws. They demonized them in the press, and you can see the parallels today. And finally, it wasn't just the Germans who did it. South of France, the Vichy government took part. Countries within Lithuania took part. In Eastern Europe, they took part. It wasn't just the Germans. The ideology of the Nazis wasn't just the Germans. And so eventually, they caused the deaths of millions of people in these concentration camps. As a result of that, 3 years later, when they were still reeling and recognizing the scale of the disaster, the United Nations was formed, which was previously to that was the League of Nations. And under the General Assembly, they put together this document. And this document had 30 articles and became known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it established, according to these rights, basic norms, basic rights that every single human being on this planet has, regardless of who they are or where they come from. And it's these rights that I want to just go over with you. There are 30 rights. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there are those I will mention that you will see the parallels of today. That these rights, you will see and recognize them, and then you'll understand how Islam addresses them, and are they being implemented today. So the Universal Declaration, again, as I said, was given, put together by several countries. And those countries, 48 nations in fact. Those countries, they included Egypt, Colombia, China, Iraq, India, Lebanon, Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, Syria, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. Out of all of those countries that has ratified the treaty, the United States is the only industrialized nation that didn't. And that's important that you understand that, because the United States from that point till now went on to carry on atrocity after atrocity in every nation you can think of where it took part militarily. Whether it was Korea, whether it was Vietnam, whether it was Grenada, whether it was Panama, whether it was Iraq or Afghanistan, those atrocities continued, and there has never been any meaningful accountability. In fact, they reject the very idea of facing charges in the International Criminal Court. So, the first of these articles essentially talks about, the first of these 30 articles, a free and that everybody is created, everybody is made free and equal in dignity and in rights. Everybody. It continues to say that no nation, on the second article, no person should be discriminated against based upon race, color, sex, language, religion, politics, or social status in property or wealth. Now think about this. Because the Prophet ﷺ, as you know, he said there's no difference between a black man and a white man. No difference. No difference between an Arab and a non-Arab. None is better, in fact. None is better than the other. Except for what? Taqwa Allah. Except for who fears Allah. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this in Surah Al-Hujurat. O mankind. So as we know, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses mankind, it's not alladhina amanu. It's not alladhina kafaru. It's nas. It's the same as mankind. And he says, we created you from a single male and single female. And we made you into tribes and nations so that you come to know one another. And then he said, if you want to have a criteria to define who is better amongst you, because one of the things that the Universal Declaration essentially says is everybody's equal. Yes, they are, but in the sight of Allah, the best of you is atqakum. The best of you is he or she who fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the most. So there's already a declaration there. There's a statement that we all recognize, but we know that there is a slight difference there, because you can be better than somebody else, but in the eyes of Allah. The declaration continues then in the third right, and that is the right to life and liberty and security. Now we know that even in Islamic countries, an Islamic state as it were, that to apply Islamic hudud and punishment and so forth, you can't do it if a person has no right to life, no safety, no security, no ability to feed themselves. So all of this sort of stuff is something that's straight from Islamic principles. In fact, it's important to note that Islam recognized the rights of people, recognized the rights of Ahlul Kitab, recognized the rights of women and children, recognized the rights of the old and the parents and so forth in the text of the Quran. In fact, if you find the masjid, yesterday I was speaking at this, I was attending this talk at this masjid, and the Imam, Jazakallah khair, came from Sudan to remind us. He said, you want to know the difference between our masajid and the masajid of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? So you know what the difference was? He said his walls, their walls were made of teen, they were made of clay. Their ground was made of dust. When the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam would perform his prayer and it had been raining, the rain wasn't stopped by their roof because their roof was made out of palm leaves, and the pillars were nakhla, it was the olive tree. That's all. And when the Prophet ﷺ would pray and his head would hit the ground and he'd stand back up again, there'd be marks of dust and mud on his forehead. People would go into the masjid and urinate, like that Arabi, that famous story of the Bedouin. And the Prophet ﷺ said, would pour water onto this place. His response was pour water and go teach the man. It wasn't to throw him out of the masjid. So the women, the sisters, they were at the back. There was no barrier. No barrier existed in the Rasulullah ﷺ's masjid. It's important we understand that. And that when a woman wanted to say something, she did. She didn't write a note and send it to the fourth, because most people at that time couldn't read. The Prophet ﷺ was a Nabi al-Ummi. He couldn't write. Most of society couldn't write. They spoke. They were known for their language, the fasaha, how they spoke and how they delivered their message. So all of these things existed, and it was a place where issues were resolved. It was a place where teaching was done. It was a place where if a child came and he played on the back of Rasulullah ﷺ like Al-Hassan did, then the Rasulullah ﷺ wouldn't break his salah. He'd continue his sajda, so he wouldn't harm his child, his grandchild. If he's giving a khutbah in the masjid, he gets down from the minbar and he sees Al-Hassan and Hussein looking so cute, dressed in however they are, and they're toddlers, and he picks them up and he said, I couldn't just leave them like that. He spoke about how your children are a fitna to you, but that didn't stop him from getting down from the minbar. Can you imagine now in today's world, child screaming in the minbar or near the minbar would say, please go look after your children. That's our response. So these rights were taught by Rasulullah ﷺ right in the heart of the masjid. The disputes were resolved. People came from abroad, from different cities, from different tribes, different nations, different empires to attend. And when they came wearing gold and when they came wearing silver or silt, he refused to see them, because he was setting an example to people so they understood that these things mean nothing to us as Muslims. This is not your sign of status. So this is what was so important for us to understand, that when we're talking about the rights given by Islam, it began, the heart, the qalb of the Muslim community was the masjid. It wasn't just a musalla, a place to prostrate your head. It was so much more than that. And I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings a time when it becomes back again, the heart, the real meaningful heart of the community. Politics is discussed, where disputes are settled, where marriage takes place, where children run free and happy, where everything happens the way it did with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this was, it continues again, and it says that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. No one shall be held in slavery and servitude. Now people might argue about Islam talks about milk al-yamin and so forth, but anybody who doesn't understand context, doesn't understand the time, doesn't understand that in fact there were no rules of engagement by the other enemy, by the Romans or the Byzantines or the Persians or all of the others. When they came along in a war and they took a woman captive, they did with her whatever they wished. That was the time in which the ayat of milk al-yamin were revealed. So there's a context to it, and it's important we understand it. But other than that, everything we have seen, the Prophet ﷺ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, fakku raqaba, free the neck. Wa fil riqab, one of the categories that exists within the zakat that we don't even speak of anymore. Who speaks of wa fil riqab? When they said, okay, we're going to take your zakat money now, lil fuqara wal masakin and so forth. Who even mentions the word wa fil riqab? That we're going to use your zakat money to free slaves or free prisoners. Nobody even mentions it. It's as if it's a dead category of the zakat. And that was the point, because Islam wanted and encouraged people to remove, to get rid of, to free as many slaves as possible. And Islam was a religion whereby, as you know, the story of Salim and Abu Hudayfa, Salim, Mawla Abu Hudayfa, that these two men together, Abu Hudayfa is the son of Abu Sufyan, and he's a leader of the Quraysh. But who leads him in prayer when they pray together? Salim. Salim, who's the servant. He leads his master in prayer. That's how Islam regarded the concept, the idea of quote-unquote slavery. Because slavery, servitude is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ubudiyya lillahi azza wa jal. That the slavery or servitude, your real servitude, is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's this saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but apparently I've heard this story that Amr ibn al-As, he said, he captured and enslaved somebody. And Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu is reported to have said that to him, مَتَى اسْتَعْبَدْتُمْ النَّاسِ وَقَدْ وَلَدَتْ أُمَّهَاتُهُمْ أَحْرَارًا. At which point did you enslave people when their mothers gave birth to them as free men? This was, if the report is correct, this was the mentality of the Sahaba. This is how they regarded enslaving somebody. And today they talk about, because of what ISIS does and other organizations like them have done, that somehow this is a representative of Islam today. So the declaration, it continues. Sorry, I have to keep putting my glasses on every time I'm getting older. No one, this is so relevant. This is so relevant to me. No one shall be subjected to torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. I sit here in front of you as somebody who has witnessed torture with my eyes. It's been subjected to torture for 3 years without child or trial by the bastions, the defenders, the ones who claim to be the upholders of this article. To no one shall be tortured. No one shall be cruelly, inhumanely, and degradingly treated or punished. I saw people beaten to death by the American soldiers. Literally, a taxi driver called Dilawar was tied up in front of me in the Bagram detention facility in 2002 in December. They had his hands tied above his head to the top of the cage. And as he complained and asked them in his language, which I didn't understand, Pashto, they hit him and punched him in his ribs repeatedly. And you know what he would say? What he said every time they hit him? Allah, Allah. That's all he said. The soldiers found it funny that he says Allah, Allah. So what they did, they took him to a separate room away from our eyes, but we learned because we saw it in the autopsy report, is that the soldiers, every soldier that night had a go on him. And what go did they have on him? They applied what's known as the peroneal strike. It's a Thai boxing style kick delivered from the shin onto the top of the thigh, and he was kicked over 100 times, which caused the blood in his leg to clot and stop, and his heart to fail. And the autopsy report said had he survived, his leg would have required amputation, and that it looked like a truck had run over his leg. That was an American military autopsy report. So this is what was happening by those who claimed to defend. Remember, they came to Afghanistan. Why? Because they said, we've got to liberate the Muslim woman. She needs liberation. She's been forced to wear this burqa. So we have to liberate her. They're in the 7th century, the Taliban. So therefore, we have to come along and liberate them. How did they liberate them? You know, recently, just now, after 17 years, the longest war in America's history. Not World War I, not World War II, not Vietnam, not Korea, not the First Gulf War. None of them lasted this long. 17 years, they've announced now that they are pulling the troops out. Does anybody know how many people have been killed? No, I'll tell you why nobody knows. Does anybody know how many people died on September 11th? I tell you, they do. 2,976, exactly, to the single digit we know. 2,976 people died on 9/11. We know that because every individual counted. The Americans made sure that every single individual mattered. How many people died just in Afghanistan? In the first few weeks of Operation Enduring Freedom? Nobody knows, nobody cares, nobody counts. Muslim life is cheap. And it's not cheap in the eyes of the West, it's cheap in our own eyes. When we die by the tens of thousands. That's the reality. We die in thousands. And so that war happened and was carried out and continued, and then the atrocity after atrocity. It's so hard to list the numbers of atrocities that were carried out by the Americans, by the British, by Iraqis, even by some Muslims as well, in Abu Ghraib. I first heard about Abu Ghraib when I was in Guantanamo by a disgusted American soldier. And there was a soldier who said what they've done to the Muslim prisoners, and he was already seeing what they'd done to us. And he knew that what was done to us was a template for what they did in Iraq. And what did they do in Iraq? The naked prisoner pyramids, the torturing of prisoners, the putting on, stripping them naked, making them lie in their own feces and urine. And you don't even know about the numbers of women that were raped, gang raped by American soldiers. In 2010, President Obama issued a directive to ensure that photographs and video images of Muslim women in their hijab and abaya being raped by American soldiers were blocked, because these photos were available and taken as trophy pictures by the American soldiers. He said, and I quote, that if we allow this to happen, it will harm our soldiers on the ground. Really? You think that the Iraqi father, the Iraqi brother, the Iraqi cousin, the Iraqi son doesn't know what happened to his wife, sister, mother, or daughter? You think they didn't know that you stopping the publication of these images is going to stop the anger? Of course they knew. And this is documented, deeply documented, and that's why, if you regard and see what happened in the prisons, Abu Ghraib, Camp Booker, Camp Bastion and beyond, you'll understand that bit by bit, after they unleashed the sectarian war between the Shia and the Sunnah, and the Americans played one side against the other, and after all these atrocities, is it a wonder that ISIS rose in Iraq? Obama admits it. He says ISIS is a result, an unintended consequence of our invasion of Iraq. the invasion of Iraq itself was based upon torture. You know, the very torture that they mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that nobody will be tortured. They tortured Ibn Sheikh al-Libi in Egypt. And why did they choose Egypt? Because they know that's a torture center in the Muslim world. If you want to master the arts of torture, Egypt's your place. Mubarak's your man. Omar Suleiman is your intelligence chief. And under him, directly, they tortured Ibn Sheikh al-Libi into giving a false confession that Saddam Hussein was providing Al-Qaeda with weapons of mass destruction. And that's why they invaded Iraq. And when they invaded Iraq, look what they did to it. And as a result of that invasion, they created, literally, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before the invasion. No Al-Qaeda, they only came in after and because of the invasion. And that Al-Qaeda in Iraq incrementally, slowly but surely, eventually became Islamic State in Iraq, and eventually Islamic State and Dawla al-Islamiyya, whatever they want to call themselves. They even had a camp called Camp Khilafa inside Camp Booker, which was an American-run prison, where the leaders of ISIS would emerge from. So it's important we understand that when they say these torture, and just so that you understand, I remember there were people arguing, ISIS people arguing, saying that it's okay to torture. If they torture, we go torture. What do they use? They quote the verses. So if you are punished, then punish them the way that they punish you. That they use that as a reason, as a way to justify torture. And you know, there are hadith the Prophet ﷺ talks about when the Sahaba caught somebody and they beat him, and he said, you torture him when he tells the truth. And there's another hadith I came across when a man said, one of the Sahaba, I believe his name was Hisham, he was walking into a region in Sham, actually, in Syria, and he says, I saw people were taking the Christians out and pouring oil over them. And he said, I swear by Allah, Wallahi, إني سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول إن الله يعذب الذين يعذبون الناس في الدنيا. He said, Allah punishes those who torture in this dunya. So there's a big discussion on when, you know, it might be possible for torture and so forth, but Islam opposes this type of behavior. Yet Muslim countries practice them, and Western countries practice them. I told you before, when I went to Libya, I began by saying I went to Libya. The reason I went to Libya was to meet with a former prisoner who had been tortured with the complicity of the British government. Earlier this year, Theresa May issued an apology. Imagine that, an apology against her involvement, the British government's involvement in the torture of Abdul Hakim bin Hajj and his wife. The difference is the Muslim countries today won't even bat an eyelid. Torture is part of the unwritten constitution of Muslim countries. It happens as a matter of routine. The declaration continues further. It says that there's equality before the law and protection against discrimination. So if you're going to be charged with a crime or accused of something, you'll be treated equally. You're supposed to be treated equally as any other human being. Remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, again, this is another term, this karamatul insan, the honor of a human being. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, that we, the sons of Adam, in other words, all human beings, have been given this honor, this dignity that should be maintained at all times. So when they spoke about the honor, and they talk about honor in the Universal Declaration, the honor of a human being, this is something, remember this was in 1948. The Quran was revealed 1400 years prior to this, and it used the terminology. So, you know, one of the things that often happens to us is we have this, I think in Arabic the term is hazima al-fikriya. It's like a defeatist belief or a defeatist mentality, which makes you believe that everything that's good has come from the West. That it's been delivered to us from the West, and we did nothing. In fact, that's what we're told. The far right tells us now. In fact, many, not even far right, even the people on the center, they say Muslims don't contribute anything to society. They're just takers. All they do is they take and they take and they take. They're scroungers. They've got nothing positive. They don't create anything. That may be true today because of the way our lands are. But Islam has been Islamicizing Europe since the beginning. And I'm just going to go on a little tangent here, so forgive me. Any Arsenal supporters here? One Arsenal supporter? Okay. I'm not into football, right? But imagine sitting at an Arsenal football match, right, and telling them that your name, the name of your football team, is Arabic. And it has come about directly because of jihad. Where's my evidence? The word Arsenal comes from the Arabic Dar as-Sina al-Asliha. Go check it out, I'm not making it up. The word Arsenal comes from Dar as-Sina al-Asliha, place of manufacture of weapons. Any alcohol drinkers here? Alhamdulillah. Is there anybody who would like to drink alcohol? Allahu Akbar. MashaAllah. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He mentions, what does He say? Anharu min khamrin ladhatin lisharibin. That's what we're promised. It's like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, you know, when you get مثل جنة التي وعدوا للمتقين. It's promised for the muttaqeen. Rivers flowing of khamr. That's beautiful to the taste. Okay. So we would like to drink some alcohol in the hereafter. But even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what does He say? لا فيها غول ولا هم عنها ينزفون. Right? He said that there'll be no heavy-headedness and you'll not be intoxicated. We want to drink but not feel that way, even in Jannah. Right? So where did the word alcohol come from? My wife was researching this recently, and I always thought that alcohol came from al-kuhul, right? The stuff that they apply on the eyes. But what does that have to do with alcohol? The answer is, it doesn't. The word that she told you, and after researching it, it comes from al-ghawl, the verse in the Quran from Surah Safat. The scholar Jabir ibn Hayyan, he's a famous Muslim chemist. The word chemist, it's a chemist, and chemistry comes from al-kimia also. He was developing the process through an alambic, which is also an Arabic word, to distill alcohol for medicinal purposes. And that's how the process came about. So imagine telling, like, on a Friday night, or tonight, some of the guys on a pub said, you know, we might not drink alcohol, but we own the damn word. And it comes from the Quran. What do you have to say about that, Tommy Robinson? So you see my point, and excuse me for digressing so much from this, is that this is all part of Islamic tradition. This is all part of, when we have this, you know, there are so many words, the Arabic word, you know, magazine. Did you know that magazine is Arabic? Really, most Arabs will know this, but do you know that? From Moazzam, the place of storage, a magasin in French is called a shop, a store. Do you know that sofa, the word sofa, you know where it comes from? Sufa, Ahlul Sufa, the poorest people used to be the most, memorize the Quran the most. I mean, there are so many words. You know, checkmate comes from the Arabic shamat, the king is dead. I mean, if you checked it out and looked into it deeply, you'll find word after word. Admiral comes from the word, Admiral Nelson at Trafalgar, Amirul Bihar, the leader of the navy. Trafalgar, Tarf al-Ghar, the place of the cave, or Tarf al-Ghar, the place of the west. SubhanAllah, my point is this, is that when they keep telling us that Islam has nothing to offer, we've offered so much already. Imagine, right, imagine calculating, you know, when you do your accounts. Imagine you're doing your accounts, right? Imagine doing them in Roman numerals. Can you imagine doing that? Because that's what they would be doing if they didn't have Arabic numbers. The Arabic number with the decimal system. The word, you know, zero, Shekh comes from sifr. Decimal, making something, bringing it back to its zero. Cipher, the word cipher comes from sifr, deciphering something. The list is endless, dear brothers and sisters. It's important that we understand the Islamic contribution because there's been so much, and that's just, what I'm giving you is a tiny, tiny flavor. And also something that we need to recognize. If you go to the Capitol building in the United States of America, you'll find that they recognize, at least, that they've got this thing in in one of the domes where it's talking about the sources of American law. It talks about the Romans, it talks about Britain, and it also says Islam. They recognize Islam as one of the sources of law for the United States of America. So don't be surprised, don't think that Islam didn't contribute to these declarations. It's very likely that that's where some of this originated from. So let's continue some more. The right to a fair trial. That's a famous one, the right to a fair trial. It's one that we have here in the UK, and probably say that it works for the most part if you compare it to a lot of the Muslim countries and other places. But there have been multiple trials here that have taken place that are miscarriages of justice. There have been multiple laws that have been passed in this country that are against the basic concept of human rights. Against the basic concept of human rights. I don't know if I'll get time to go through all of them, but I will address some of them. That there will be no arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Arbitrary means just it's on the whim of the government, and that it can do this whenever it decides to do so. That it won't happen. Now, have there been arbitrary detentions and arrests in this country? The answer is yes, there have. Have they happened recently? Not just in the time of the Irish, when there was internment without charge or trial. That happened, and you know Bloody Sunday happened as a result of that. But here in the UK it happened. In 2001, after the September 11th attacks, 16 North African and Middle Eastern men were detained in Belmarsh high security prison as terrorists without charge or trial. Most of us, the Muslim community and beyond, did or said nothing about it at all because we didn't know, and we didn't know because we didn't care. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man la yahtam bi umur al-muslimina falaysa minhum." Whoever doesn't care about the issue, the affair of Muslims, is not from amongst them. So in reality, people were being detained without charge or trial here in the UK, in complete opposition to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it was happening here, even though we say that Britain as a country is a place where you're more able to obtain your rights than, say, in any of the Arab or Muslim world. The presumption of innocence, that's another one. To presume somebody to be innocent of a charge. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in relation to anybody who accuses somebody of something, هَاتُوا بُرْهَانَكُمْ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. Bring forth your proof if you're truthful. If you don't have proof, and you know Islam, how it deals with the issue of just those people who accuse a Muslim woman of adultery. That if you can't bring forth your evidence, what happens then? Lashes, 80 lashes, and your testimony will never be taken again. You will never be regarded as somebody from whom any testimony can be taken, even if what you're saying is the truth in future. So the rules of evidence Islam places are immense, and this is again to the protection of the woman, so that nobody الذين يرمون المحصنات, those who do accuse the believing Muslim women. And it's important that we understand this, because this is part of the presumption of innocence, that unless you bring forth your evidence and proof, and it is verifiable and checkable, then the presumption of innocence will remain. And what does it mean to be presumed to be innocent? Here in this country, you can be presumed to be innocent, but treated as you're guilty. So you're accused of a crime, you're arrested, all your possessions are taken from you, your house is raided, everything that you own, your family, all of their items can and will be taken away, and you can be, and often as it happens, placed in remand, in custody, as a prisoner. And for all intents and purposes, as far as the prison authority is concerned, you are a prisoner, subjected to the same rules. The only difference is that you are not convicted. Other than that, you have the same regime. Your neighbors, literally in the next cell, could be people convicted for a crime for which they're facing serving 30 odd years. So there's no difference in your treatment. And that's something that, again, Islam doesn't or shouldn't regard you. It doesn't, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, forgive me the verse, تَجْعَلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ أَفَنَجْعَلُ الْمُجْرِمِينَ كَالْمُسْلِمِينَ كَالْمُجْرِمِينَ. That do you equate Remember, one of the things we spoke about is everybody's equal. But do you equate the Muslim, the one who submits, to a criminal? Are the two the same? They're not the same, yet they're treated the same. So again, this is something that Islam doesn't do. It doesn't equate somebody who is a normal person, who has the presumption of innocence, as somebody who is a guilty criminal. No interference with privacy, family, home, communications, honor, or reputation. So again, you could say that this sounds like something completely what Islam would say. Islam would say, how nobody has the right, the state doesn't have the right to interfere in your life, in your privacy. Islam puts great emphasis on privacy. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith that the sin committed in public is far worse, outweighs the sin committed in private. So, and we know that many of the rules, many of the sins that a person commits, if he commits them in his home and privately, and nobody's aware of them, he's not propagating them, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive him if he asks that many times. But if the person is committing those sins openly and calling for the commission of those sins, then it's a different matter altogether. So Islam regards the privacy as something very important. Your private life is your sharing, for example, the details of the bedroom. It's prohibited in Islam. We don't talk about our private matters in that way, unless it's to solve a dispute and you go to a qadi or to a judge. So again, according to the words, it sounds fine. In practical application, as we see today, your entire life can be laid bare and laid open in the name of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of ideas and thought. And that's something we'll go on to in a little bit, because that is one of the main contentions that the Universal Declaration of Rights has against Islam and the Muslim community. And that's one of the reasons why in 1990, in Cairo, there was a Cairo Declaration of Human Rights for Islam, or in Islam. And it's important that we make a note of that, because this was the response by over 45 Muslim countries. And despite all of the corruption that exists in all of the countries, they said, and I quote, that the Universal Declaration is based upon a Judeo-Christian tradition, and it cannot be implemented without trespassing on Islam. So what were these points? There were certain points within, if you follow through, most of the Universal Declaration and the Cairo Declaration mirror one another. They're pretty much the same, except for certain things. And one of them is about freedom of expression. And the freedom of expression here is limited, that people are free, indeed, even according to the Islamic the Cairo Declaration, that people are free to have thought, free to have expression, free to believe what they wish, but they are not free to harm the honor of the prophets. They are not free to oppose the Sharia. Now bear this in mind, subhanAllah, bear in mind the corruption of the Muslim world, the deep corruption. Bear in mind how far they have followed the West in almost every single thing. America's bases, I mean, just think about how much influence America has. America has bases right throughout Saudi Arabia, on the Jazirah al-Arab. That's one of the biggest bases in Qatar. We know Qatar is like this, quote unquote, more Islamic country. But one of the largest bases, if not the largest base of Americans in the Gulf is in Qatar. They have bases in places like Uzbekistan, Morocco, or they're everywhere. The secret prisons, detention sites, the whole secret rendition program could only have operated because of the involvement and the participation of these countries. Bear in mind all of that, countries still in 1990 signed this declaration because they felt that the Universal Declaration was infringing and impinging on Islam's rights, on the right of the Sharia, on the right of the Sharia to be the primary source of law in Muslim countries. So they recognized this and responded to it. But again, those who are the naysayers who say Islam is not compatible, remember the Prophet ﷺ, you all know the story of the Hilf al-Fudul. The Prophet ﷺ said that it was the house of Abdullah bin Jud'an, that before Islam began, that they brought together leaders of different groups and individuals, different tribes, and with the view that everywhere, anywhere that there is somebody that is oppressed, a mazloom, that we will come together to the defense and the help of that mazloom, of that oppressed person. And the Prophet ﷺ said that if there was something like this now, today, even after the rise of Islam, he said, I would take part in it. And that is important that we recognize that, because that was even with non-Muslims, even with mushrikeen. Mushrikeen, Sharr al-Bariya, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes mushrikeen as Sharr al-Bariya, the worst of creation. Despite that, he said he would take part in something in order to defend against the oppressed. And that's important that we understand this. We often talk about oppression and the concept of oppression. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنِّي قَدْ حَرَّمْتُ الظُّلْمُ عَلَى نَفْسِي. I've made oppression haram upon myself. وَجَعَلْتُ بَيْنَكُمْ مُحَرَّمًا. And it made it between you, it's haram. فَلَا تَظَلِمُوا. And do not oppress. Allah Quran says, لَا تَظْلِمُونَ وَلَا تُظْلَمُونَ. Don't oppress and do not be oppressed. Just as equal. Don't be oppressed and don't oppress somebody else. That's supposed to be our identity. Again, the problem always comes back into implementation. It seems like these people here are closer to the implementation of their ideals than we are of ours. And that is the problem for us as Muslims. The declaration continues, as I said, there's no interference in all of these things: family, home, honor, and reputation. Because these are things that people hold important. I mean, a person, if you don't have your reputation, you've pretty got nothing left of yourself. So that, especially for a person, is important. Yet you find often cases of people being defamed in the media again and again and again. And again, that's all to do with the balance of freedom of expression and the right to have a reputation saved. I think, there's several more to go through, and I've only gone through half of them, and I think it's about time that we come to... We have some time? Okay. I'm going to go through some more of them, inshallah. If anybody feels like that it's time to stop, just raise your hand and we can go into question and answer. The freedom of movement, this is an important one for me. Very important. We are leaving Brexit, we are leaving Europe because of not just the freedom of movement, in fact, but because the freedom of movement of other people that we claimed we weren't racist against, but essentially we are. That these people freely move across Europe, across continents, and we don't really like it. So it's part of it's the article is it 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the freedom of movement, that you should be free to move to wherever you want to, free as long as you're not committing crimes, to earn a living, free to take your family with you, free. That is enshrined within UN Declaration. And yet practical application, you can hardly go anywhere without a visa, without approval, without getting stopped at airports and ports of entry and exit. Law, after all, in fact, not just even that's not that. One of the following, I think the third or the fourth after this, is actually the freedom, the right to nationality. That's a right according to the UN Declaration. In practical terms, and it says that arbitrarily your nationality cannot be revoked. But it happens all the time. In fact, in Britain right now, there are numerous Muslims who are mostly outside the UK, but some in the UK, who've had their nationality revoked based upon arbitrary rules, based upon rules and evidence that they cannot challenge and see because it is deemed to be national security and secret. That's happening today. It's happening right now. I know several people who've had their nationality revoked. I know more people, including myself, who can't travel because passports have been revoked. So where's your freedom of movement now? In theory, good. Practical application, the state decides. So it's important that we understand that these rights, because they are spoken of as, Islam is not compatible with Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, we say, well, neither are you, because you don't practice what you preach. Because what you say and what you do are two different things. They say on their tongues, that is not which in their hearts. So there is a hypocrisy that again we see happening. There's this beautiful, I think you must have heard it, Brother Fuad must have heard it. it's a poem by somebody, Bach, is an Egyptian poet. It's called a Ta'shira. Yeah, he knows it. It's beautiful, and if you could, I could translate it, I would. But what he says, you know, when I was young, I was this young kid, and the Arabs used to sing this song, the Bilad al-Awtani, that the Arab world is my land, and Kull al-Urbi ikhwani, and all the Arabs are my brothers. And I was singing, I was happy and lovely, and I used to dream. I dreamed that I'd go from one place to the other, one place to the other. I'd go and travel the Muslim world, the Arab world. He said, but I grew up, and they wouldn't give me a visa. Literally, that's what he said. And then he starts talking about all of the beautiful things that exist all the way from Somalia to Morocco to everywhere. And he said, if we came together, I don't care what you are, which background you call yourself from, if we did this together, if we came together, if we held on, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا, if we held on, as Allah says, hold on to the rope of Allah جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, and don't be disunited. He said, I swear, there will be no starvation, nobody suffering in Somalia or Sudan or anywhere else. Everybody would be surviving and living and prospering from all the produce in the Muslim world, in the Arab world in particular. But in the end he said, what's wrong with you Arab leaders? He said, Wallahi, I hold you to account. I hold you to account. وَقَاضِيكُمْ, he says, for what you did. And so that was part of, you know, that was one of the poems that was happening during the Arab Spring. So that was the right to freedom of movement, and it continues, as I said, the right to nationality. That you have the right to be somebody. You know, today, even as we speak, Theresa May has attempted to make people stateless. That you have no state. According to you can't be left stateless. You have to be the national of some country. But not for lack of trying has Theresa May attempted to make people literally stateless, in practical terms, stateless. That you leave the country, you go out and you, as some brothers have working on aid projects in Syria or other places in Pakistan, they get a letter, your family member gets a letter.
The only option I found is the other Palace on Palace Street in London. Want to try that one?
Try it.
I knew what to say now. Okay, I know MI5 have like the techniques, but you know, they need to be a little bit more subtle. So they've had their nationality revoked. The family gets a letter home saying that we have decided, based upon a very opaque description of what they think the person is doing, that you are no longer, you no longer have a right, to British nationality. They've done that with passports. You no longer have the right. They say that a passport isn't a right; it is a privilege. That's the term they use in the letters they send to people to revoke the passports. That your passport isn't a right; it is a privilege. So, well, according to the UN Declaration, it's a right. It is a right because it comes under the right of nationality and the right of movement, freedom of movement. It's important, brothers and sisters, that we understand these, not to attack anybody, but to understand where we really are, because here are the ideals and the principles, here's the practical application, and here's the deen. And in the midst of all of that, where do we fit in? So I'm just giving you some of these flavors, and I hope it's not an overload, because when I was reading and researching some of this stuff, I thought, the first thing that came to my mind, what does Islam say about this? And every article I was looking at, I was thinking in my head, I know a hadith about that, I know an ayah about that, so Islam does bear these in mind. Islam is compatible, in fact is far more compatible with this, because the only different thing is, as I said, the practical implementation. I pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings us to a time at which we will see the practical implementation of human rights according to Islam. There's the rights of marriage, and that's interesting because it talks about consent, that every man and woman should consent. Again, there's another difference between practical implementation and idealism. So we know in Islam a woman and a man can only get married with consent. But in today's time, or there have been, or I know several people who got married without consent. It just happened. Parents decided, and society decided, and so forth. But again, they put this in the Universal Declaration, but this exists within Islam, and that's why I think in the Muslim Declaration, the Cairo Declaration, they didn't oppose this. They didn't argue about this. Again, protection of family, something very important. Bear in mind that the Muslim countries did sign this. All of this stuff does happen in Muslim countries, so they do separate. They target people's homes, they arrest people without charge or trial. There are much more people entering Islam than there are leaving Islam, at least openly. What they're arguing, what the argument here is that Islam doesn't allow a person to leave his faith and then to propagate that. That's what the argument is. So the Universal Declaration said that if it means that in their propagation that they will be cursing the prophets, the Sahaba, the companions, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so forth, and Allah, then we can't allow this. Remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to counterbalance, He says, وَلَا تَسُبُّ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. Do not curse, not curse, do not swear at those who call on other than Allah. In other words, don't swear at, don't curse those who are mushrikeen, because those who call on other than Allah are mushrikeen. For they will end up cursing Allah as animosity to you. So even if they do that, so what's the response to somebody who curses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Is not to curse them. We need to learn that as a response. If you want to argue with somebody, call to the way of Allah with wisdom and good and kind words, and argue with them. Argue with them in that which is the best. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's response is to those people who wish to argue with Islam. So there is a freedom of thought, there is a freedom of religion, there is a freedom to think, but there isn't a freedom, which is what they've been arguing for recently, to curse, to insult. And which time they do it. Why is it important? In my book, it's really important at this time. Islam generally is a very confident religion. It should feel confident and not afraid of people challenging our views, challenging our beliefs, challenging whatever it is they want to say, as long as they do it. And to be honest with you, some of them, they do curse the Prophet ﷺ. They do say things about him, but they did it at the time of Rasulullah. They did it. They forget cursing him. They struck his beloved face. They attacked him. What was his response? What did the Prophet ﷺ say when they hit him? What did he say? What did he say when the children of Ta'if were let loose upon him to stone him till he was bleeding? What did he say? Allah hadi qawm. But innahum la ya'lamun. He said, "Oh Allah, guide my people, but they do not know." That was his response to him being cursed. Forget curse. The Prophet said, "Sibabu Muslim fisq wa qatluhu kufr." Cursing a Muslim is fisq, is rebelliousness, and killing him or fighting him is kufr. Despite that, they fought him, and that was his response. So it's important that we understand. Now, there are rules and regulations about, I don't want to get into that discussion about those who curse the Prophet, but I want you to just bear that in mind in the society where we live, that Islam is strong, very strong, to the point of, as I told you, somebody's beating you on the legs and trying to kill you, and you're saying, Allah, Allah. Islam is strong, and don't let them make you think that it is weak. That somehow they will say something against Allah or the Messenger or the Sahaba, and somehow it's going to shake our faith. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? إِنَّ النَّاسَ قَدْ جَمَعَ عَلَيْكُمْ فَزَادَتُمْ إِيمَانًا وَعَلَى رَبِّهِمْ يَتَوَكَّلُونَ. The people have gathered against you, and what happened? What did the Sahaba do as a result? فَزَادَتُمْ إِيمَانًا. That the Iman rose up, they became even more strong in the Iman, and their tawakkul was on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Their reliance was on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's what their response was. So let's bear that in mind when this comes along to us. That this is the world in which we live. They want to يُرِيدُونَ لِيُطْفِئُوا نُورَ اللَّهِ بِأَفْوَاهِهِمْ وَاللَّهُ مُتِمُّ نُورِهِ وَلَوْ كَرِهَ الْكَافِرُونَ. They wish to extinguish the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with their mouth, and Allah protects His light even though the pagans detest it. So bear in mind that now we're in a time when they want to say that it's freedom of thought, freedom of expression to draw cartoons of the Prophet ﷺ. And of course, we thank those who won't take part in it from the media, but there are plenty who do. In social media, you see them often depicting Rasulullah ﷺ in whatever way they want to. it doesn't hurt my faith at all in the slightest. It makes me stronger. That's all. And that's how we should respond. It shouldn't be we're going to run around and jump around and scream and shout. That's not our way. So the freedom of opinion, expression, and so forth, yes, that's one of the things that lacks. It lacks in the Muslim world also, especially to be able to speak out against tyranny and oppression. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Afdal jihad, kalimat al-haq and the sultan in jair." That the best jihad is speaking a word of truth against an oppressor. And you know the hadith, he said that the best shaheed is Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib. And a person who stood up against an oppressive ruler, and he enjoined good upon that ruler and forbade evil upon that ruler, and that ruler killed him as a result. That's the best shaheed. So bear that in mind, that we are also an ummah that puts great pride in speaking up against injustice, even against a ruler. And we know that the best ruler is whom? The ruler amongst those 7 who are placed under the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That day when no shade will count except the shade of Allah. The just ruler. He is the one. So Islam places a great deal of importance upon justice and speaking out against injustice. I'm going to, inshallah, I think stop at this point because it is important, if you do get a chance, to look at these universal declarations and see them. It's not very long, it's not a document, isn't very long. It's good to look also at the response by the Muslim nations and how they looked at it. But for me, this is really an important point, that the dignity of a human being, no matter who he is or she is, should be protected at all costs, as much as we are able to do so. If that person himself or herself is undignified, which is what happens often, you get people who are undignified, who are asking for dignity, then even then, we don't need to tarnish our own dignity. Because in the end, we are ambassadors. Our beards, our hijab, our thobe, our niqab, our names, our practice, whether we have, whatever, however we appear. We are ambassadors of that which we believe in. We are carriers of the message before we've even spoken. Whatever you do or don't do is a reflection of your belief. It's a reflection of your aqidah, reflection of your iman, reflection of your fiqh. It is, and that's the part I think that societies have missed. That how do you become an implementer of those ideals in a time when we talk about ideals, but the practical application of it is so distant. So in the end, my message to you, brothers and sisters, is simply this: is that we do recognize the importance of a Declaration of Human Rights, but this was a Western. It began from a Western perspective, and it was because the West was ripping itself apart, tearing itself apart, murdering and butchering each other on an industrial scale that there has never happened in the history of mankind. Not even Genghis Khan killed that many people. The only people that have killed this number of people in human history have been the British, the Americans, the Germans, the Russians. They are the masters of killing in the human race. There is no one who is greater that has the capability, ability, or experience of killing that many people in humankind. So therefore they said, oh my God, look what's happened to us. Or some of them did rather. And let us now enshrine within these rights, these articles, that we're not going to do this again. How many times are they going to have wars in which they say never again, lest we forget? You never forget anything. You just mastered the arts. Instead of having a bomb that pulverizes, or a whole series of bombs that pulverizes a whole city like Dresden, and you kill 100,000 people, you've now developed missiles that you say can pinpoint an individual and fly right through the bedroom and enter into the place where it's targeted. You don't care if you kill everybody else in the bedroom, but you've killed less people. In the end, it doesn't matter because they don't, as I said, they don't count the number of the Muslim dead or anybody else's dead. So inshallah, I'm going to stop there. I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to benefit from some of this, and whatever I've said is good, inshallah, is from me, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whatever is bad is from the shaitan. Jazakumullah khair wa akhir da'wan alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Oh, subhanallah, tea. Another invention of a Muslim world. You know that, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the only people in the world who drink tea with milk is the British and the Pakistani and Indians. Any questions, comments, objections?
Not clear for the excellent talk and the words of encouragement at the end. When we approach the topics of these Western terms, like for example human rights, and we seek to maybe compare Islam or perhaps draw similarities, I think there needs to be like an element of caution, because these terms, like you mentioned, they're Western terms. They have deeper connotations, deeper meanings, and that don't always reconcile with Islam, as you pointed out at the end, right? Some of these ideas. So if you look at human rights, the ones that we find most enshrined in society today, that we hear about constantly, like in schools, etc. Personal freedoms, which is sexual freedom, freedom of religion, and so on and so forth. Maybe to draw a parallel, we know that, for example, the Khulafa Rashidin were more or less democratically elected, right? However, it would be very unwise for us to go around saying Islam is a religion of democracy. So I think there needs to be this portion, just to end, inshallah. There is something that we find in the Seerah, where the Muslims, when they were living alongside the Jews in Medina, they thought they had come across a mutual term that they shared. So the Jews used to refer to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as Ra'ina. The Muslims thought this was a mutual term that we have similarities in, but actually the Jews knew the deeper meanings behind it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu la taqulu ra'ina wa qulu anzurna. Don't take these terms from the kuffar, rather say as Islam commands. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Alhamdulillah, that's a very good point. I think that's interestingly, I mean, why did at the Cairo conference, the Cairo Declaration, why did it take them 42 years? Is it 42 years? Since 1948. 42 years to even come up with the idea that this is there's a problem with Muslims signing up to this in this way. And from what I've understood, it was actually the Iranians, from whatever their new revolution they were having, and they said that this was a Judeo-Christian tradition being imposed upon us, the Muslim world, and that they cannot implement it without trespassing on Islam. So they came up with this declaration. I don't know why it took them so long to. I think that Iranian part, no matter whatever you view of them, recognized that from an Islamic prism. I think it is important. I spoke to a sheikh, a very, very knowledgeable sheikh yesterday, just on this. I said, can you use this term, Islamic human rights in Islam? Is it okay to use it? And Sheikh Abdul Hayy Yusuf, you may have come across him. And he said it's okay to use these terms. It's okay because Islam, there are terminologies for certain things that exist today that didn't exist in the past in technology and so forth, and just development of humankind. He said, but it is important that we understand it from an Islamic framework. That it is, as you said, there are expressions that exist. If this declaration had been based upon an experience with Islam, if that's why they've done it, then I think that would be, my view is that we shouldn't adopt anything from it at all, because they are entirely setting the agenda. But this was Europe. This was Europe that had committed the greatest atrocities that mankind has ever seen against each other. It was entirely European, especially World War II. World War I, the Ottomans were involved in some degree, but World War II, it was entirely a European construct, and they are the authors of their own story. So they did it with, even though Muslim countries were signatories to it, they did it with their own experience in mind. So that's kind of my thoughts on it.
Sure.
Who are the good guys in the political world? Like, is there a person or a government who's like trying to do it right, or who we can?
Allah, the brother asked me for the sisters, who are the good guys? And Allah says, "Alam tara ila alladhina yazakkuna anfusahum billahu yazakki man yasha." Have you not seen those ones who offer purity to themselves? Allah offers purity to whoever He wishes. Like, so, who are the good guys? Allahu a'lam. I don't know who's the good guys. All I know is these are the good principles. The people of the past are ones that we can be sure of, and those who follow the correct traditions and ways. And those today, who are the right people, who are the good people? Everybody will know them amongst themselves. You will know from who you interact with. What are your ideals? First of all, you have to look at what's your ideals. And if you see somebody manifesting those ideals, people, places, individuals, countries, nations, regions, cities, towns, then inshallah you'll see an appearance of that. But I can't geographically locate them right now without getting in trouble.
I was thinking more along a politician or a world leader.
You want me to endorse somebody and get in trouble forever for endorsing them?
Can I just, because I think it's a brilliant question brothers asked, because it's a genuine question. A lot of people want to know what to do because they're very confusing times. So if I may just give my little sort of humble opinion, I do support Cage, so I'm linked to Cage, for example, right? So the objective there is that I would say, look at who is facing the powerful and speaks to the powerful about justice. Now, it doesn't mean Cage gets everything right? But the point is, which way are you holding to account the power that this is? Only Allah's powers counts. Secular human power is fallible. Anybody can make a mistake, and therefore, as a human being, look at it critically. Anybody who exercises power. So when you start from the government down, actually it'll come down to yourself. You're thinking, am I being unjust to my wife, my children? So in terms of thinking of as a fair, just person to all of God's creation. So that doesn't just mean human beings, it means animals, it means the environment. So you're fundamentally all around thinking about being a just person. So I would say, look at groups and individuals who focus on that aspect. It's very difficult because you might be called an extremist, you might make people feel uncomfortable, because majority of people just want to focus on rituals and keep quiet about everything else. But as a Muslim, and in this country, I don't think it's difficult. It's not against the law. And Muslims walking freely, he might have possible gun, but he walks around freely. But you can talk about these things. And I think this fear factor amongst Muslims, oh, it's so confusing, to stick to our basic rituals, keep quiet, that is giving in. I think that is dangerous. So I hope that.
So that's our installed Cage guy.
I did declare my interest.
Any questions from the sisters at all? Any questions from the sisters at all?
No.
Silence is taken as consent, so that means there is a question.
No, they've spoken, so no, it's not.
Okay.
I just had a question with regards to the colonial context. We're sitting in Britain. Lots of us are here because of the British colonial past, Pakistani and Bangladeshis. I visited in Paris last year, and the dynamic was very interesting. It was the French colonial past, which was in the Juma congregation. And obviously 300 years of colonial history, our countries how they were created, our political system. How does that fit into what you've been talking about?
It fits in greatly. So, I mean, one of the things that you spoke of, or that I spoke of, was that the ideals of the Muslim world, and how long it took them just to sign their own declaration. They have literally, as part of their constitutions, whether it's Algeria, whether it's Morocco, whether it's look, you'll find the Quran somewhere. They want entirely, maybe it's family law, or maybe it's some parts of domestic law that are relegated to the kind of Islamic teachings that they allow. Most of the time, they have, as you'll find in Pakistan or other places, where the constitution has been heavily influenced by whoever colonized them. So when they talk about human rights, and that's what I said, it was very important that primarily they signed up, all of these countries, including Pakistan, it signed up, Turkey signed up, Syria signed up, Saudi, not Saudi, later, it was Saudi, signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that means they signed up to somebody saying, where they said it's okay for somebody to, based on the freedom of expression, to change their faith and to propagate the changing of that faith. Now, why would they sign up to some, or agree to that if they had believed in that, or opposed it, they would have said that, no, well, we dispute on this, we need to change this. But they didn't. So they accepted that request, and it took them 42 years for them to come along, and I think only because of the Iranians who pushed it. So it is important that we understand that this history of colonization, of the importing of ideas into the Muslim world has permeated us, and it's going to take a long time. If we thought that type of colonization polluted the Muslim world, the type of colonization that exists now, which is a proxy, is even worse, because people actually believe they're free. They actually believe what they're doing is in quote-unquote national interest. And one of the declaration's points here actually later on is about nationalism. That nationalism won't be invoked or incited to the point at which it becomes, to paraphrase, dangerous to other people. And that's what's happened in the Arab and Muslim world, is they've replaced the colonization with a type of nationalism that has been the cause of what you've seen post-Arab Spring or even during it. Is there any other questions? Yes, brother.
Related to your experience and mashallah, how you've come through that in Guantanamo Bay. I know it might be slightly off a tangent, but still it's intriguing. What did you, how did you manage to stay strong and come through and still be, mashallah, here with us and presenting all this?
Alhamdulillah, by Allah's grace, Guantanamo was a long time ago for me. I was released in 2005, we're now 2018. So many more world events have taken place, etc. The sad part is that even though all of this has happened, Guantanamo is still open. A couple of years ago, my best friend, somebody I consider my best friend, was released from Guantanamo after 14 years, Shakir Amr. We were actually at this masjid last year together. And alhamdulillah, that's a milestone. That's, for the British Muslim community that we reached. That him, Babar Ahmed, there were petitions of, between them, over almost 250,000 people signed the petition for their release. So that has been a great, as I said, a milestone. When I sit with him, I was with him just the other day, I forget all of my experience almost. Because how can I compare 3 years to 14 years? How can I compare my experience, even though it is important that we don't belittle anybody's experience, not even somebody who's had a family trauma or a physical or health trauma. Each person's trauma to them, each person's experience is as heavy to them as they can bear. But when I see him, there's a dua that we make when we see the people who are afflicted by something. We say, oh Allah, we praise Allah for not making us face the same affliction. So when I see him, I think, subhanAllah, I came home, I was still able to take part in my children's formative years. I was still able to take part in their school progress and so forth. He wasn't. He came home to see grown-up children. They didn't recognize him at all. Had there not been like a campaign for him, I doubt whether they would have recognized him in the street if they'd seen him. So how do you compare with that? And again, the important thing for me is, so he was released in 2015. There are still people there. There's still brothers and sisters, brothers that I know in Guantanamo, still to this day, that we're fighting for. And who is keeping them there? The very nations who crafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in which says that nobody will be tortured, nobody will be cruelly, inhumanely and degradingly treated. Those are the ones that are holding them. Those are the ones that abused them and kept them in this way. That's part of my role in Cage. That's my main role in Cage, is to remind, to hold to account the governments and people that this that exists, that process that happened, is part of a far wider picture in which torture, false imprisonment, the removing the rule of law, the removing of presumption of innocence, all of those things we spoke of today have been applied time and again. The drone strikes, Guantanamo is one place, right, with the extrajudicial killings, killing people. No, they stopped at, you know, what happened in Gatwick the other day, right?
Yeah, the drone.
It's London's, or Britain's second largest airport on lockdown because of a couple of drones. Those drones don't carry weapons. Those drones don't carry Hellfire rocket missiles that kill people. They're just drones you can buy from Amazon or something. So imagine, Britain has deployed drones in Syria. America has deployed drones in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Libya, and killed scores of people, hundreds of people. Nobody bats an eyelid. So that's been kind of the, let's not detain people without charge or trial, let's just kill them without charge or trial. That's, you know, and so that's making more political, but on a personal level, what really gave me inspiration inside prison, was the Quran. There's no doubt about it. If I knew the Quran to some degree before I went to Guantanamo, when I went to Guantanamo, I knew it intimately. It became my companion. The story of Yusuf alayhi salam became so relevant to me. Everything that he does, everything that he goes through, everything that he faces. And I remember I went to a Jewish school as a child, so we used to do the story of Joseph. But it never became, from my story, from my perspective, the emphasis on his prison was never more pronounced than it was when I was a prisoner and a Muslim. And his response to prison. His response is, Rabbi Sijnu Habbu Ilayhim mimma yad'un ilayh. Prison, Allah is more beloved to me than that which they call me to. And then the idea that actually he was in prison before that when he's thrown into a well, a young child, left in the dark in a little enclosed space. And he's accused of a crime he doesn't commit, they conspire against him. But really the end result is what I found most fascinating. When I come to that, I would break down into tears. إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ Yusuf. They say, oh, you're Yusuf. And he responds, yes, I'm Yusuf and this is my brother. And then he says, لَا تَثْرِيبَ عَلَيْكُمْ الْيَوْمَ. When I looked at it, I went back, just broke me down into tears. Because after everything that they did to him, broke his father's heart, broke he didn't know his connection with his family. And what does he say in the end? He said, there's no vengeance upon you today. You know, the truth is, if they didn't do what they did to him, how could he have been placed at the treasury? How could he have been placed at the top of the treasury? If they didn't do to him what they did to him, would the story of Yusuf even have happened? So it had to happen. And as a result of it, it's preserved. It's as a story in the Quran, you won't find any story that's told from the beginning to the end like a story like that. From the beginning to the end, story. And it's known as Ahsan al-Qasas, the best of stories. So to me that was, I can't tell you how much that happened. Any other questions, reflections, comments, thoughts? So I think inshallah we'll end it. Jazakumullah khair, inshallah. Please do, if there's anything I've said this evening that has piqued your interest, go to the website cage.ngo. If you don't already know about the organization, inshallah learn about it, because as the brother said, this isn't just for us, this isn't just relaying to you some of these details and explaining the hypocrisy of X, Y, Z. It's that we are in the fight. I'm speaking to you as a person who's in the fight, bearing the scars of the fight. In the midst of it, on the front line, literally taking on government. Literally facing them being targeted as an organization, our accounts being closed down, our members being arrested, prior to that being tortured, our members being stopped at airports, harassed, forced to give passwords, and we refuse to give our passwords and Facebook. That's the organization we're part of. And you will not, by Allah's grace, but I pray that I'm inshallah in the future, find an organization like this anywhere in this country. No way. sometimes people say, oh, we support organisations like Cage, and I say there is no organisation like Cage. There isn't one. Name me one. Bring forth one that has been targeted the way that we have. And that despite that targeting, we stood up and continued to challenge government. There is no organisation like Cage. And I don't say this in a way of pride. I wish and pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that there are many organisations like Cage. But up until that happens, I pray that you continue to support us with your dua, with your with whatever skills you have. We are in need of researchers. We are in need of people who can articulate the message, speak, write, and debate. All of those things are things that we are in great need of. So, inshallah, if you can support the organisation in any way. The last thing I will say financially, because really our fight isn't the financial fight. That's just a means. Our fight is really in the articulation. The Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba, remember, they used to, it was amazing. The Prophet ﷺ, said, to learn to do wrestling and swimming and horse riding. Those were all the physical aspects. The Sahaba used to learn to sword fight and to use spears and bows and arrows, and they were experts with Khalid ibn Walid used to fight with 2 swords. Zubayr ibn Awam used to fight with 2 swords. But above and beyond this, their ability to express the word was par excellence. There was nobody who could speak as well as the Arabs. Nobody could deliver message. And even the Jahili Arabs today, to this day, if you want to learn Arabic grammar, you go to the Sha'r Asr al-Jahiliyyah, you go to and try to learn the poetry of the days of ignorance. The Arabic was that good. The ability to deliver the message, to articulate. And one of the things I think today that we are not very articulate in being able to deliver our message. And that's what keeps us down. We face somebody who tells us, I am a native of this country, I am this, I'm that, I'm from this particular background and this level and this status. And we already feel somehow inferiority. And it was one of the practices of the Prophet ﷺ to send his Sahaba, to send the companions to learn the languages of the Assyrian and of the Jews and so forth. Because communication used to exist in their language, written communication. And he taught the Sahaba to respond with verse against the enemies, those who would attack Islam. So it's really important that we become articulate. Sorry, I'm going to go on forever. If you allow me, I'll go on forever. So, stop.